Mary, this London's a wonderful sight, with the people here working by day and by night. They don't sow potatoes.
I'm Monica McGoldrick, the middle of 3 daughters of Joseph McGoldrick, who was the oldest of 3 children of Daniel McGoldrick, who was the middle son of Neil McGoldrick, who was born in Donegal, Ireland, and immigrated to New York at the age of 18. Our family never talked much about family history, but I did hear that Neil McGoldrick was a great guy and very successful, and there were a few pictures of him, as well as a few books and an old sea captain's desk. I vaguely knew that he had died of a stroke and that he had 2 sons and a daughter, Thomas, Daniel, my grandfather, the middle child, and Mamie, the youngest. In researching our family history, I eventually learned that there were 5 other babies born into the family, but they had not survived. I knew my grandfather pretty well. He died when I was 7. But I never met his 2 siblings, though I did meet Tom's wife, Mary Comerford, and their daughter, Margaret Kelly, who, in the 1970s, showed me a family Bible with births and deaths recorded in it, though the Bible has apparently since disappeared. In 1972, having become a family therapist and being interested in Bowen theory, which led me to genograms, I began to try to learn about my family history. Neil McGoldrick had come to the U.S. at about 18 and early went into business with his cousin Peter Lawrence McGoldrick, a son of Eamon McGoldrick, one of 4 brothers who had come with their father John McGoldrick from Riverstown, County Sligo, to Donegal. They came through the Barnesmore Gap to the area of Ballybuffet and Killygordon, to a place called the Crossroads or the Cross, which had the typical pub and large Catholic church, where they all settled in what they called the Glen. Peter Lawrence had a large family. In fact, the oldest daughter, Mary, had married another cousin, Lawrence McGoldrick, descended from Thomas, another of the original 4 brothers, whose family had migrated to Scotland. By the time I came along, there were many McGoldrick relatives around Brooklyn and Long Island, a few of whom we had some periodic connection with. But it was never at all clear how exactly we were related to them, or to the many other McGoldricks who had migrated to Brooklyn from that area of Donegal and been in the liquor business with Neil and or Peter or Lawrence. When I got interested in the family, I began to try to make a family tree and went to the relatives I knew for help. No one seemed to know how we were connected, which was odd if you think about it, since it was well known that the 2 cousins, Neil and Peter, had developed a successful liquor business together on Flushing Avenue and Oxford Street and had set up many other relatives in business. Indeed, the relatives on my side of the family seemed to know nothing much at all about the family history and never wanted to talk about it. But fortunately, several McGoldrick cousins from the Peter McGoldrick side were extremely helpful to me, most of all Joan Morell, who was a great-granddaughter of Peter McGoldrick himself. Others who were very generous as well were her sister Irene Vaughan Knox and 2 of Peter McGoldrick's grandchildren, Jim McDonald and Anna Dannemiller. They also introduced me to various other family members, John Sweeney, Kathleen Crilly, Francis Muller, and others. Peter had married in 1849 and apparently felt betrayed by his wife Nancy Gallagher's father, who had promised him a farm when they married. So he had decided to go to California in the gold rush, leaving his wife and first child in Donegal. He traveled by foot through the Panama Canal to California, where he seems to have been more involved in the liquor business than with the gold rush. He traveled back and forth to Ireland for some years, having all of his 5 children there, and didn't settle with his family in Brooklyn until at least 1866. The story was that Peter McGoldrick had gotten into trouble with the local priest in Ireland and been, so to speak, excommunicated or called out for usury at least 3 or 4 times. According to my cousin Joan Morell, it was because he had brought grain back to Ireland and charged interest for it, which the priest didn't think he should do. Others thought it was for leaving his wife to go to the gold rush or refusing to take the pledge not to drink. According to cousin Jim McDonald, who wanted to warn me about the family not wanting to talk about issues, there were other reasons.
I never was able to get any information from Edward or Peter, either of them, as to where they were and the relations and things of that nature. So even before I made the first trip to Ireland, they just freeze up. They wouldn't tell me anything. Don't be bothering the people.
Really?
Yeah.
Why?
But I don't know. I have no idea why, but I couldn't get anything from them.
Now that was when? When was the first time you went?
The first time I went to Ireland was in '69.
So your brother or Peter could have given you perfectly good information.
But they were not in favor of me.
Really?
No, they've been there. They stayed for quite some time.
Really? Well, now, your Uncle Eddie, he had gone back before that, hadn't
Oh,
he?
yes, he'd been back. He'd been back at various times.
Well, I wonder why that was.
I have the faintest idea. I often did hear her speak about parish priest there who was Mr. Boyle. In those days, priests were not allowed to be called father.
Oh, is that right?
So Mr. Boyle was the parish priest.
Oh, I didn't know that.
And the only priest I ever heard my mother speak about in Ireland was Mr. Boyle. Apparently, he didn't look with a very kindly eye on Peter leaving the wife and children to go out looking for gold in California.
Oh, yeah.
I don't know how Annie looked at him.
What do you think?
I don't know. The wife, I don't know how she looked at him. Reason why for the excommunication?
I don't have any idea.
I heard that Mr. Boyle would get up and make these announcements.
Yeah. Well, I guess I did hear that he took offense at the priest taking offense, that he was very mad, Peter, about being excommunicated, that he thought it was unfair. I think, very.
I would imagine.
Yeah. But I guess I heard somehow that he was very outspoken about it.
Well,
but I don't.
I knew nothing about that. Apparently, he went back to Ireland with Eddie, as I told you.
Neil had married in 1862, opened an account at the Emigrant Savings Bank that year, next to John McGoldrick, the son of Owen McGoldrick, whose father was one of the original 4 brothers. By 1870, Neil at 33 and Peter, now 50, were listed in the census as liquor merchants in Brooklyn, living next door to each other. The census said Neil's real estate was worth $15,000 and his personal estate $4,000. Peter's real estate was worth $10,000 and his personal estate $2,000. How, I wondered, did Neil, who was so much younger, have more money? As I said, all we grew up knowing about Neil was that he'd been a great guy and very generous and successful. A newspaper article I once found about a liquor dealer's party in Myrtle Avenue Park in Brooklyn in 1884 described Neil as weighing 287 pounds, but refusing to enter the fat man's race, which was open only to those weighing over 200. The committee tried to induce him to enter, but he refused. However, the article said, in the dancing afterwards, Neil danced a breakdown against time, which resulted in a draw. Many other McGoldricks, including Peter, Lawrence, Thomas, Patrick, John, and Daniel McGoldrick, all relatives in the liquor business, were part of the affair. Neil McGoldrick died of a stroke at the age of 50 in 1887. He had a huge funeral at Sacred Heart Church, of which he had been a major founder. One of his obituaries said that 100 carriages had accompanied the remains to Holy Cross Cemetery, and another said several thousand citizens witnessed his internment. In the newspaper, they reported that the priest had paid high tribute to Neil's character, including, but for his generosity to the church, to his neighbors, and to his fellow men, he would have become one of the richest men in the parish. One obituary called him the father of democracy in the 20th Ward. Another obituary, entitled "The Honest, Big-Hearted Democrat Laid to Rest," said that the family home was almost too small to accommodate the assembled throng who came to Neil's wake. A third obituary said to the public he was little known, for he lived in the main in the limits of his neighborhood, had never that we can remember been a candidate for any general office, and was distinguished for strong common sense, trustworthiness whenever his word was given, and a helpful and most charitable disposition, and for that species of zeal on behalf of democracy which shows itself in a vast amount of drudgery at the polls and in the interior activities of the organization, without which all speaking and writing would be in vain. After Neil died, his family was completely impoverished. There was no will, but when the estate was probated, there was virtually nothing left but the family Bible, a few books, some dishes and utensils, a table, chairs, a sewing machine, and bedsteads and bedding. Neil's widow and unmarried daughter lived on in very strange circumstances. My grandfather and his brother Tom made their way but struggled. There seems to have been a real cutoff of family connectedness from the time of Neil's death in 1887 until at least the 1930s, when my father became well known in New York politics because he was appointed city controller and there was some level of reconnection. In 1975, after my first trip to Ireland, I discussed the mystery of Neil's poverty with my McGoldrick relatives from Peter's side. They were as mystified as I was, having heard the same sentiments I had, that Neil was extremely generous.
Did you ever hear of any conflict between Peter and Neil? Why?
No, I never heard anything about that.
Well, I don't know. Why was there no money when Neil died? That's something I can't figure out. Because he was a wealthy man.
So good to everybody and gave it away.
Did he drink, maybe?
I never heard anything, no.
Did you ever hear anything about him at all?
Just that he was always so good to everybody. Maybe he was over generous.
Well, they said in his obituary, if it weren't for his generosity, he would have been one of the richest men in Brooklyn.
Well, that fits in with a...
But still, to die a pauper is a little,
Yes, that's a
a
strange.
little much.
Very strange.
Being generous is one thing, but leaving yourself nothing.
A couple of years ago, I discovered a newspaper story from January 1887, the year that Neil died of a stroke on August 23rd, showing a judgment against Neil McGoldrick and others for which the premises of Flushing Avenue and Oxford Street in Brooklyn were to be sold at auction January 12, 1887. Neil had a stroke and died 6 months later. To backtrack to my efforts to learn about the family history, I want to mention in particular 3 stories which would seem to convey that somehow there were secrets and mysteries in our family history that went beyond just the family's lack of interest. My cousin Joan Morell, from the Peter McGoldrick side of the family, was, as mentioned, most helpful in introducing me to family and arranging meetings to learn our story. In 1974, Joan and her sister Irene took me to Holy Cross Cemetery where all the McGoldricks were buried. They showed me the enormous monuments for their family, one for Lawrence's family and one for Peter Lawrence McGoldrick's family. She said their family would often go to the cemetery, and whenever they did, their mother, Irene McGoldrick Vaughan, would insist on taking them to a place where there was no stone not far from the huge monuments to her family's ancestors, and point out the spot to them, saying, "Here's where the great Neil McGoldrick is buried, and what a shame on our family that no one has ever put up a stone for him. I wrote to the cemetery and confirmed that Neil and all his family had been buried there even though there was no stone. What surprised me especially was that Joan's mother, Irene, had been born in 1887, the very year Neil died, so she obviously never knew him and must have heard about him from earlier family members. It was interesting that she'd come to think enough about someone who had died before she was born to tell her daughters decades later that he had been unfairly treated. Meanwhile, I was trying to learn whatever I could about the family history, but by the time I was interested in the early 1970s, my grandparents and their siblings were long dead. My father was unable to talk because of a stroke. My Uncle Raymond was in a nursing home and also unable to communicate. My Aunt Mildred had been the one to save family information and had made notes and written questions, but she had been unable to figure out the family story at all. But as I thought about resources, I thought about my grandmother's best friend, Catherine Shanahan, who was also our dentist's wife and still lived in the neighborhood. It occurred to me that people often tell their secrets to their friends, so why not give her a try? She was thrilled to talk about our family, and it reminded me that many of us tell our friends things we don't even tell our families. I made an audio recording of our conversation, not always clear. For whatever reason, she always called my grandfather Dad, as she does on the audio. I began the questions about the family by saying that my father had always told me there was a long period in which he was alienated from his father and later felt bad about it. Mrs. Shanahan proceeded to tell me that my grandfather was a very stubborn man, as had been his father Neil. I'd never heard anyone talk directly about Neil and was amazed and curious. She proceeded to tell me a story she heard from my grandmother that Neil had taken the fall for others in the family over some business deal.
But it seemed that they were all in the liquor business. Mm-hmm. So Dad and Uncle Tom should have gone to medical school or law school because they had the brains. So you could never deny the brains of the family. And his father was a pretty ironclad guy.
That was Neil McGoldrick?
Yes, that was Dad's father. And he was a pretty stubborn man. And so they were all that way. And because he took the blame, there was some little scandal or something. I read it from him. And he had to take the responsibility of the family of paying up something,
Who took the blame? Dad took the blame?
Dad's father.
His father took the blame. I can't understand that. I know there must be something there, but I never understood that.
Every family had a man from Ireland. They made some money on the lease. And then cut him in on the share, but he had the responsibility of it. But he was awfully smart, Dad's father. He was an honest man with a setback. He was what you would call a square.
Oh, really? Mm-hmm.
Anyway, at that time, whatever this weak thing was, Dad's father had the brains. Then when something came up and they didn't do it, he had to do it to cover the family. And the others sneaked out and didn't pay their share. It was really a true story. Maybe you put a copy in the phone. Maybe it was, I think, whatever the scandal was, whatever it was, Dad's father had to take the brunt of it.
I never understood that.
I couldn't, I didn't, and of course I should have paid more attention because I thought Mildred would know, but Mildred can't get any more. No, you might as well talk to the spoon. She won't talk about anything. And she's mean about it in a sense.
But I couldn't understand because I always heard that he brought all the relatives over and said
everything. Said nothing. They owed him money. That time money was scarce. Now let me tell you, if you had $1,000, you were rich.
As you can see from these excerpts, Mrs. Shanahan had a lot to say about our family's history. Whether it was all true might be another matter, but it was data to put toward understanding what had happened in my great-grandparents' and grandparents' lives and undoubtedly affecting my father and his siblings. I was especially interested in Mrs. Shanahan's description of how hard it was to get my Aunt Mildred to talk at all. During this time period, I was making every effort to seek out relatives who would talk to me. One cousin, Jim McDonald, made it a point, when he heard I was hoping to go to Ireland to seek out relatives, to tell me not to bother. He said he'd already gone there and there were no more McGoldricks in Ireland except for one in Galway who wasn't interested in relatives. My cousin Joan Morell was very generous in connecting me with many relatives, including John Sweeney, who had grown up in Scotland but every year visited McGoldrick relatives in the Glen. He gave me very specific directions on how to find the cross and said there would be many relatives there still. He told me there had been another relative, Packy McGoldrick, who had once made a McGoldrick family tree, but he wasn't sure who had a copy of it. He told me that Packy's brother, Lawrence McGoldrick, who had worked for Prudential Insurance in New Jersey, had given him a copy, but that Lawrence had died some years before. On a whim, I called Prudential, who put me on hold, only to pass me along to Lawrence's son, also named Lawrence, who had been working for the company for some years. Lawrence happily gave me a copy of the tree, which, for the first time, showed our family as descended from one of the original four brothers, John Tude McGoldrick. But with John Sweeney's instructions, I was sure I could find the place, if not any family members. So in 1975, when our family took a trip together to County Cork for my parents' 35th wedding anniversary at Ballymaloe, I convinced my parents and husband to come with me to Donegal to try to find where the McGoldricks were from. First off, we got to the cross, which was a crossroads with not much more than a huge church and 3 pubs. I took a wander in the graveyard, having believed cousin Jim MacDonald that the McGoldricks had all died or left. I couldn't find any McGoldricks and finally decided to ask 2 older men for help. I showed them my family tree and said that I was trying to figure out how the family fit together. Once they saw the tree, they realized that they themselves were relatives. They were the Gallagher brothers, James and Peter, but they were McGoldricks many times over, as the family intermarried with McGoldricks many times. But, they assured me, the person to talk to was Hughie McGoldrick, who wouldn't be home now, he'd be down in the bog. I thought I misheard them, because they were referring to a live McGoldrick. Finally, they convinced me there was such a person, and he knew a lot about the family history. Following the Gallagher brothers' Irish directions to Hughie's house, which are never very clear to an outsider, we finally got to meet Hughie and a whole gathering of McGoldricks the next morning. When I explained to him that I was the great-granddaughter of Neil McGoldrick, who I was sure had come from here, but I was not completely sure how he fit into the family tree, he said he knew very well who Neil was, but could I prove I was Neil's relation? I assured him that that was the part I was sure of, as I had documents and pictures going back to him. But I wasn't sure how he fit into the larger McGoldrick family tree. I showed him Packy's family tree, and he continued quizzing me about how could I be sure I was descended from Neil McGoldrick. I reassured him that that was the only part of the story I was really sure about, since we had lots of information proving that part of our heritage. But we were unclear how we fit into the other McGoldrick relatives. He and the other members kept talking among themselves, and I couldn't make out their conversation. My mother, who wasn't even part of the family, was trying to make conversation. My father, who'd had a stroke, couldn't really talk but was smiling a lot, and my Greek husband was taking pictures. Finally, I figured they wouldn't or couldn't help me and decided to leave.
So what kinds of stories did you ever hear about your grandfather or my great-grandfather?
Well, I don't know, but my grandfather he was married 3 times.
You didn't believe me? Well, tell me who was that?
And the second one was McGoldrick.
That's another story in America, was that McGoldrick over there married a McGoldrick, that same side of the family.
And the comment of one of his cousins was, he didn't want to let the money get out of the family. And what did your grandfather do besides his married his 3 wives?
Oh, he was a school teacher.
Yeah?
Sort of a head school, I would expect in his young days. You ever tell of the head schools in this country?
Yes, I just heard of it. Because they couldn't go to schools. They had to do it by the hedges.
Behind the ditches.
He must have taught all the people in this neighborhood.
Oh, he did, surely.
And what did you ever know him? Your grandfather?
Not at all. He was dead long before I was born.
Now, can I ask you if there were any of the second generation that you would ever have known?
Where are they now?
Any Owen? Would he have died way before?
Oh, I would surely. Maybe 150 years. 100 years ago or more, anyway.
And all of those would have died. Yeah.
Master Cobb. No, I didn't. I would expect he was living when I was young, but I don't remember him.
Was he a teacher here too?
Oh, he was surely.
He took over after your grandfather?
Oh, no, not in the same school at all.
No?
Oh, I teached the way across, just on the horizon over there. And then Master Pat was another teacher.
Master Pat. His son?
This was no, he's you know Packy McGoldrick.
Yes.
Right?
His father. Oh, here, this one.
Now, anything else?
I wish I could figure out my exact connection. You think my Neil would be here, a brother of Patty, or an Owen?
He would have been. I would expect he was a son of Patty's now.
A son of Patty, so he'd be in here.
He would have been. He should have been in there.
Would have been one of Master Pat's brothers. Would that be it?
That would be it. That'd be it.
Now, let's see, time-wise.
That's according to my information.
Michael, the one who married Mary
He's
Winkle.
dead.
Patrick.
He's dead.
Lawrence, he's
Dead.
dead. Did you know him?
Oh, did I?
Really?
Oh,
Because he came here.
Oh, I saw him here, surely.
You did.
Oh, I did.
He took some movies.
A couple of times he did, surely.
I
Last
might
time
have-
I was here,
Yeah.
I remember him taking them out there. My father was in the minivan. It was him who was interested in.
I have them at home. I should have brought them with me.
Oh, dear.
His son gave them to me. So then there's Thomas.
Thomas is the one supposed to be living now in America yet.
You don't know where, though.
Sort of a rover, just.
Oh?
He's be an old man now, he'd be over 70.
Mm-hmm.
Ought to be a rover at 70,
well, anyhow, so the rest of them's all dead. Peter Henry's dead, Hannah's dead. You finished now?
Well, we got to start. There'll be more. I wish I were here in the night when you could really get to talking about it.
Oh, well, sure, I'll maybe tell you more some other time.
Yes, the next time I come. Try to figure it all out.
Oh, you have it all. I would say fairly accurate. There might be an odd
Got a few mistakes, yeah.
No, odd mistake. But that Neil McGoldrick was supposed to be this man's father.
Yeah, his grandfather.
You're marvelous. I've been sitting here thinking, I just hope when I'm 10 years younger than you are, that I have half the wits you've got.
Goodbye. Thank you.
And I hope we'll meet again.
Oh, we will. Thank you very much.
Wait till I tell you that.
After we had said our goodbyes, Huey and his brother Eddie took me by the arm around to the back of the house for a private talk. I had an audio tape which I had forgotten to turn off, so I unintentionally recorded the whole conversation. Huey then told me the secret that Neil was an illegitimacy and was thus in the wrong place on the family tree. He said he thought Neil was the son of Patrick the Old Delvis, another of the 4 original brothers, and that he thought Neil's mother's name was Mary Carlin, but he wasn't sure. In conversations he and I later had on later visits, Huey said Neil's mother had been perhaps at the workhouse or had mental problems or something. He wasn't sure. But he was sure that Neil had been placed in the wrong place on the family tree and was not the son of John Tood McGoldrick.
I wouldn't embarrass you if I told you so.
No.
You sure?
Yeah?
Well, Neil McGoldrick, that's the one you're inquiring about.
Yes, right.
He was supposed to be a son of that man, that Patrick Delvis. You know, but he was born. He was an illegitimate son. Yes. I didn't like to say, you know. But that's no what that. He was the best McGoldrick. My father said always he was. But I didn't like to tell you. So,
Did you
still,
you didn't know here?
No, that's probably why I didn't hear it.
probably why they left him out.
Yeah, that's right. Do you know who his mother was? I'll be right there.
She was supposed to be Ireland. She was from down the field, just, you know, the neighbour one.
Yeah.
Yeah, from Manel.
Well, that really helps a lot because that helps. Then I can now.
That'll fill in that gap now.
Sure. Now I can understand why they would have.
But you can keep it to yourself.
Yes, I will. Oh, I really appreciate you telling me that because it's now that helps when I get it straight.
So, the father always said he was the best McGoldrick. He always heard them saying he was the best McGoldrick.
Do you think that's why he maybe left? What was the story? What did you hear about him? That he just grew up with the other brothers and sisters?
Yes, but he went away young, you know.
But he went away. Yes, I heard he came to America when he was about 16.
I'm sure he did.
He must have just tried to get away.
Ireland. C-R-L-I-N.
And did she ever marry his mom?
Oh, I don't know, you see.
Huey said he knew very well who Neil McGoldrick was because his own father, Johnny McGoldrick, when he would get drunk, used to talk about Neil, saying he was the best McGoldrick who ever went out to America. My puzzlement, as with Joan Morell's mother, Irene Vaughn, was why did Johnny McGoldrick, who was not born until 14 years after Neil had left for America, never to return to the Glen, and who was only 18 when Neil died in Brooklyn, why did he tell his son over many years about Neil? And why did he only talk about him when he was drinking? When my father and his brother Raymond visited the Glen in 1928, they visited the Gearys, descended from Patrick the Delvis's branch of the McGoldricks, which makes it seem that they knew that those were their closest relatives to visit. But if this is the case, why would Packy McGoldrick, himself a grandson of Patrick the Delvis, not have known how Neil was related to him, and not gotten it right on his tree, unless somehow Neil was raised by other relatives and not by his father? But if he was, as Huey said, an illegitimacy, and it was his father who was the McGoldrick, why didn't he have his mother's name Carlin? Many questions remained. I returned to the Glen every year for 9 more years until my son was born in 1985, and then occasionally for the years after that, staying in touch with Huey until his death in 1990. I continued to search for information about how exactly we fit into the family. Finally, in 2018, I discovered through my DNA that actually Neil McGoldrick was not by blood a McGoldrick, though he was a Carlin. So he must have been somehow fostered into one branch or another of the McGoldrick family. But the secret of his exact heritage was never told. So we must now await further DNA evidence to see if we can piece together the mystery even further. The stories told to me by Joan Morell, Catherine Shanahan, and Huey McGoldrick remain intriguing parts about our history that we will probably never quite know.
Nor barley nor wheat, but there's gangs of them digging for gold in the streets. At least when I asked them, that's what I was told. So I just took a hand at this digging for gold. But for all that I've found there, I might as well be where the mountains of morn sweep down to the sea.
Did you ever hear why they moved from Sligo in the first place?
Not at all. I think it must have been hard times at the time.
Yeah.
I hear that the first of them ever come through Barnes Gap. Were you through the gap? So you were.
We came through there today.
Come through the gap. It's the first of them ever came through the gap. And they had nothing with them, only a goat.
Oh. Is that right?
I heard that. Only a joke.
But I suppose that time, you know, what time
Listen, there were lots of McGoldricks who didn't have a goat. The one who went to California walked through the Isthmus of Panama, you know, where the Panama Canal is now, which would be, you know, it would be jungle. It's, to go through there, it's incredible. And he walked through and he carried his shoes so he wouldn't wear them out. Now there are snakes and, oh, God, you can't imagine.
You know, he's in woman.
Father
boy.
Then have to
Right.
put
But it doesn't say the
No,
date.
it's
The
a
chapel.
No,
It only says when he died.
The original story Daddy told me was, you know, Daddy told me as a joke one time. I had no idea.
Well, maybe that's why there's no information on this family, because the Royals were feuding with them. Was there ever a fight with that family?
Not tonight. Was the
The
Bible?
Boyles and the McGoldricks?
No,
I don't know.
not at all. Not no.
Was this priest from that family?
The two Boyle priests? No, they weren't.
No, they weren't from
they
that
were
family.
from
No, they weren't from that
down
family.
the
No, there was no feud now tonight, and I was nearly heard that there was a feud of any sort. There was no feud.
About it was Boyle and might have been
There was a feud of some sort
with Boyle
with
and
Boyle and Slayton.
oh, I that's it.
With
And
Father
Slavin?
Slayton. But
Father Slavin.
Not from the McGoldrick Slayton. My father Slayton, he was a priest here from Sally he was from the States for years too.
Oh, yes?
And then he came home, died in Sally
And he had a fight with these Boyles here?
Well, I don't say a fight, you know, but there's some differences anyhow. They weren't supposed to be looked after, and that's all I know.
Oh, really?
Whatever it was about, something I don't know. I fear it was something about. They wasn't doing them well or something like that. And then didn't please the priest. It's not how to raise a kid altogether. It's very simple thing to do that.
No, that's true.
Where the mountains of morn sweep down